Well, after the recent release of the long-anticipated Superman movie, I was in the mood to reacquaint myself with Guy Gardner, the obnoxious Green Lantern featured in the Superman movie, who has a long history in comics. But before I dive into that, I did want to briefly cover the comics that I would normally cover this week. By the way, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I typically talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I normally pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Warning, I'm going to be freely talking spoilers for every comic that I talk about, so be aware it's your first and only warning, but I still think these comics are worth reading. I'm going to briefly comment on the comics originally released to the Ultra tier on July 9th, 2025, and originally published on June 11th, 2025. Not much to talk about in this group because of a lot of lighthearted stuff. Trinity, daughter of Wonder Woman #1, very silly and goofy, almost feels like it's intended for kids and not part of even the DC Universe continuity. It just seems to be that goofy. Robin and Batman, Jason Todd #1. I'm interested in the story that's going to focus on Jason Todd and that period where he's Robin, but the art style, it's all done on what looks like heavily textured paper in a watercolor style, making it feel like almost a dream sequence or something that doesn't really count as real in some way. So there's just something about the art that was really putting me off. I'll probably give the second issue a try. Action Comics 1087 is reestablishing the Superboy part of Superman's life in the current DC continuity, and they're doing some interesting things there, including a great moment where, in a moment of doubt and uncertainty, instead of summoning up his own strength internally and stuff, Clark instead listens to his dad. And I'm like, man, that's a cool moment in that issue. So that's Action Comics 1087. Supergirl #2, very light and goofy and cartoony, not my thing at all. Batman Dark Patterns #7. I am interested in seeing how that story develops, but nothing really to comment at this point. Green Lantern Corps #5, also a little too lighthearted for me, but ending, I think, a story arc or getting close to it, so I'm looking forward to what comes next. Aquaman 6, still enjoying Jeremy Adams' run, but I don't really have anything to say about that issue, or Batman and Robin #22. But let's get to Guy Gardner, my least favorite Green Lantern. Well, I don't know if that's true anymore. I think upon reflection, I don't know if I'm not going to rank them. Anyway, DC Universe Infinite has a page that's titled Get to Know Guy Gardner, and then they list a bunch of issues that are, I guess, key points in the character's publishing history that you can use to get to know him. I think this is an okay list, but it is unfortunately missing some key issues that they do not offer on the service. And I'll get to why that is in a minute. But Green Lantern #59 is the first introduction of the character, but it's more of a what-if story. The Guardians explain to Hal Jordan that there was actually two choices for Green Lantern, and you were equally worthy and as this other guy, Guy Gardner, but he was further away. And so when Abusive crashed, he just was aware that there were two options. He chose the one that was closest, and that was the only difference in who was chosen. But then the Guardians kind of showed this simulation of what would have happened, quote unquote, if Guy Gardner would have gotten the ring. And so we see this sort of imagined continuity in which Guy Gardner got the ring instead of Hal. And so it really just amounts to being a what-if story. Well, at some point after that, in issues that are not included on this Get to Know Guy Gardner page, Hal Jordan decides he wants to at least acquaint himself with Guy Gardner, seeing him as a potential kind of backup, since clearly he was worthy in the eyes of the Guardians to be a Green Lantern. And so over the course of, I think, a number of issues, he was getting to know Guy Gardner. Well, Guy Gardner just can't catch a break, and he got hit by a bus or something, and he went into a coma, and he was out of it for a while. But then at a period in the middle of actually Crisis on Infinite Earths, the big crossover event that rebooted DC's continuity and incorporated all these other kinds of properties that they'd purchased into a single continuity. It's the very beginning of my Essential Issues series. I do a big exploration of Crisis on Infinite Earths, so you can check that out. But it's in the midst of that, when Hal is at that time not a Green Lantern, he's on the outs with the Guardians, that they give Guy Gardner the ring. He wakes up from his coma, but his personality seems to have been altered by it. He's got like a rougher, nastier, meaner attitude or something, or maybe it happened prior to them. I'm not quite sure. I actually own these two issues they reference here, Green Lantern 195 and Green Lantern 196, but I haven't read them in forever. But that is kind of like the time when, okay, Guy Gardner gets the ring and he becomes a Green Lantern for the backdrop of Crisis on Infinite Earths and a bunch of other stuff leading up to it. These issues on this Get to Know Guy Gardner page are just a bumpy ride to get to know him. There's not a nice, clean presentation of his origin. And that includes the next issues they feature, Guy Gardner Warrior 11 through 14. We are now deep, years later in the 90s in Guy Gardner's solo book. By this time, he's got the yellow ring that he got from Sinestro. More on that in a minute. But they decided to take 4 issues of this run and retell his origin story. Well, even this is a bumpy ride because it's not just all set in Guy Gardner's past. No, a lot of the story is him on an adventure fighting aliens and stuff, and they're doing weird crap with his mind so that he goes into a dream world and starts like visiting, like the ghost of Christmas past or whatever, visiting these past periods of his life, and even having an ability to interact with and manipulate them. So it's a very rough presentation of his origin that's not clean at all. That said, we do get, to my knowledge, the first telling of his upbringing, in which his parents, his dad specifically, both verbally and physically abused him, beat him regularly, treated him horribly, spoke to him in horrible, horrible ways. And so you can see why this guy later on would just have a bad attitude toward life in general. So I think it's worth getting those nuggets because they do explain some of why Guy Gardner is just such a stinking jerk and so obnoxious in so many other kinds of situations. But and really that is put on display, I would say, most in the 1990s Justice League series, which initially was written by Keith Giffen. This actually started in 1987 and it went through 1996. If you saw the Superman movie and you were wondering who is this Guy Gardner character, that version of Guy Gardner is almost certainly most inspired by the way Guy Gardner is portrayed in this series. Now, in the movie, he's less sexist and maybe a little less immature, but that team dynamic where his other team members don't respect him and all that kind of stuff, all of that was part of this run in Justice League in the late 80s and the early 90s. And he is not only portrayed in this run as obnoxious and brash, and he's also very sexist at times and just really immature. Now, of the comics and the series I'm talking about involving Guy Gardner, this is the one I'm least familiar with because although there's some interesting conflict going on between members of the Justice League in the opening issues of the run, by the time we get to around issue 7 or 8, it starts leaning into a more of a goofy side, which takes the sense of weight and stakes out of the adventures, the crimes that they're stopping, stuff like that. And that just in general makes me less interested. I like to have some weight and stakes. That said, I think I'm going to continue reading this series, or at least skimming through it, up until the Dan Jurgens era, which is it starts right before about Superman, his death, his battle with Doomsday. And I've read a couple of the Justice League issues that are around that situation and was interested and curious about the Justice League at that time, but didn't have the money to buy the individual issues. Well, now on DC Universe Infinite, you pay one price per month or per year and save some money that way, and you get access to all of this stuff. So I am interested in getting to that era and seeing what I think of it. That's also the time at which Guy Gardner has just recently acquired the yellow Green Lantern ring. And if you're interested in finding out how he gets the yellow ring, and you want to do that just using DC Universe Infinite, unfortunately, you are stuck with just Guy Gardner Warrior number 14, which really finishes up his origin story and very quickly, in passing, describes him becoming a Green Lantern, eventually that going south, and him getting a yellow ring. But it's almost completely in passing. It's not very satisfying. It's not where that tale is actually told. But if you're stuck with DC Universe Infinite, that's the only way that it's going to be covered on the service for the foreseeable future, as far as I can tell. Why is that? Well, that's because writer Gerard Jones wrote a number of stories, including the story of Guy Gardner gaining the yellow ring and a number of Green Lantern issues from the 1990s series. Well, in 2016, according to the Wikipedia page for his entry, he was arrested. He was convicted of charges of possessing and distributing child pornography. And so he got out of prison in 2022. But I am pretty sure, I haven't heard official word from DC on this. I haven't seen a statement from them anywhere, but I'm pretty sure that's why you can't find anything of his, as far as I can tell, on the DC Universe Infinite service. I've got real mixed feelings about that. Obviously, I think that it is like beyond horrible what he did in possessing and distributing child pornography. And so to even in the same breath mention disappointment in not having access to these issues is problematic. But looking at these two things distinctly, I am sad that there's not access to these issues. I think about MD Bright, the editorial staff that also worked on those issues, and their work also has been removed on these issues, is no longer available because they were part of those creative endeavors as well. And horrible people can write good stories. I don't mean to say that in judgment of him. That's before him and the Lord, where his heart is at. I hope he's come to know Jesus. I don't know anything about the man, But people can do horrible things, and then they can also do good things in other areas, or quality work in other areas. And I do think that there's a number of things about Gerard Jones' run that is quality work. And is interesting to read, enjoyable to read. And so just purely on that level, I'm disappointed that people don't have access to those things. But how do we sort through that? I mean, that's a complicated thing morally, and how should we feel about DC's decision to do that? I don't have any definitive things that I would say, but as you're processing that, you might consider watching a video I posted a few years back called Christians, Boycotts, and quote-unquote supporting sin with purchases. That's a over 40-minute deep dive using scripture as much as possible to explore this issue of what do we do when we are thinking about interacting with entertainment that has sin involved in its creation, or very sinful people that are benefiting from it if it succeeds on the market, different things like that. So that's for your consideration. Again, Christians, Boycotts, and quote-unquote supporting sin with purchases. You can check that out as you're sorting through that. In the meantime, let me get you up to speed a little bit on what those issues are that Jones wrote that are not on the service and why they're significant for Guy Gardner's story. The first one would be Green Lantern of the 90s series, number 25, in which Guy Gardner and Hal Jordan, a bunch of stuff went down that made it okay to have more than one Green Lantern on planet Earth. But at some point after all that, the Guardians were like, listen, the Earth can only have one official Green Lantern assigned to it, I think. Or maybe two at most, I don't know. John Stewart's in this cover as well, and I didn't reread this issue. But basically, Guy Gardner and Hal Jordan, they get in a fight. I think Guy is the one that initiates it and basically says, hey, let's duke it out once and for all, figure out who the best Green Lantern is, have a fight. Whoever wins gets to be Green Lantern of Earth. Whoever doesn't quits the Green Lantern Corps. Hal agrees to this. A fight ensues. Guy loses. And so at the end, even though you can tell he regrets his rash words and is wondering, is Hal really going to call me on this? Hal basically says, hand the ring over, you're done. And so he is good to his word, and he quits the Green Lantern Corps. But then after that, he's not quitting crime fighting. He's not quitting trying to do good out in the big nasty world that we live in. And so there's a 3-part miniseries also written by Gerard Jones called Guy Gardner Reborn, in which he first tries to be like a tough street level hero using guns and just whatever kind of things he can buckle to himself to fight crime, quickly realizes he's not going to be good going up the same caliber of criminals that he was able to go against as Green Lantern. So he cleverly uses his connections with other characters, manipulates them in different ways in order to get himself from A to B, that is to say, Earth to out in space to the grave of Sinestro, because it occurs to him, holy crap, Sinestro, who was dead at this time in the comics, was buried with his yellow ring, which gets a charge off of, I believe, the constructs that other Green Lanterns create. So it's on a different charge cycle, but it functions almost identically to a Green Lantern ring. And he realizes, if I can get my hands on that, I can get back in the hero game. Yeah, things will work a little different in terms of how I'm going to recharge it. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And so this is the story of how he gets across the universe, gets his hands on that ring, and then reinvents himself as Guy Gardner, just going by his name, using the yellow ring. Now, are these 3 issues of Guy Gardner Reborn worth hunting down? I don't know. Again, this is for the hardcore. I think what DC Universe Infinite offers for those who want to familiarize themselves with Guy Gardner is enough. This and Green Lantern 25 are more for those who read him on DC Universe Infinite and are like, oh, I'm really on board. I want to go on the journey with this character. I want the complete story or whatever. This is for those people. Guy Gardner Reborn on Amazon, I think you can get each issue for a few bucks plus shipping, and so it's not crazy to the idea of getting all 3 of them. And I would guess that you could also find this in some comic shops, if there are such things anymore. Very sad, very sad. Yeah, so I don't think this will be crazy difficult to hunt down for someone who wants to. I also don't think it'll be crazy expensive. But anyway, Guy Gardner Reborn, 1 through 3, that's what you're looking for if you want to see this part of Guy Gardner's story. Well, why would you want to? You might think, well, he's a Green Lantern. That's the part of him and his life and his story that I'm interested in. Well, I think that Guy Gardner undergoes a great development and maturing in his character that begins happening somewhere in the era where he has the yellow ring. And so to really get the lead up to that, to the beginning of what I think is a really worthwhile evolution of his character, you've got to read Emerald Twilight. This is the 90s Green Lantern series. These issues are available on DC Universe Infinite. Green Lantern, the 1990 series, issues 48 through 50. And I've covered this in my Essential Issues series before, so if you want, you can just watch that, and I give you kind of a blow-by-blow of the major events of the story. Or you can read it for yourself. But this is the story of basically how Green Lantern Hal Jordan loses it all because of Coast City being destroyed in the events of the return of Superman. And he goes nuts. He takes out the Guardians, dismantles, disassembles the Green Lantern Corps, absorbs the power in the Central Battery, renames himself as the villain Parallax, and for a number of years in 90s DC continuity, he is this tragic, complex villain, and there's no Green Lantern Corps, there's just Kyle Rayner. It's a very interesting part in DC history, one that it was hard to read, surprising to read at the time. I had mixed feelings about it at the time, but I also enjoyed a lot about the Kyle Rayner era of Green Lantern. Anyway, it's in the wake of Emerald Twilight, when Hal Jordan is Parallax, that eventually he and Guy Gardner go up against each other. And this is starting in Guy Gardner Warrior. I would say you would want to start reading around Guy Gardner Warrior number 18. Which is a story arc, a 4-part arc called Emerald Fallout. And it's all told in the pages of Guy Gardner Warrior. So 18 through 21, this leads to him having this final knockdown, drag-out fight between him and Hal Jordan, in which at the end he is stripped of the power, the yellow power ring. It's no longer an option. It doesn't function. It is just done. And at that point, he once again is without power, but not wanting to give up the life of the quote-unquote hero, I guess. And so he goes on a search for power and very conveniently discovers at one point, this is going to sound just stupid and crazy, but they make it work in some ways. He very conveniently discovers that there is genetic tampering in his ancestral bloodline, that an alien race tampered with human genes in an effort to create the ultimate warrior, splicing and mixing traits of thousands of the most powerful biological races in the known universe and creating one super being out of them. And he just needs to have these abilities unlocked in him, which over the course of this kind of new origin story for Guy Gardner happens, and he becomes this sort of ultimate warrior type of character. And similar but different to the Green Lantern ring, he can create and manipulate that which he imagines, but it's not energy constructs. He is manipulating his own body, turning his limbs into guns and big morning stars and maces and shields and armor and all this kind of stuff in a way that is portrayed in the artwork in a body horror-esque fashion. If you like John Carpenter's The Thing, where things explode into guts and blood as they transform, I think you might find this power set concept very interesting. I certainly did, as someone who likes body horror. And so this is such an interesting part of Guy Gardner's history, and it really is in this run, in the issues leading up to it, and also after this big shift with these new powers in the issues following, where he is kind of like addressing ghosts of his past, as it were, coming to terms with certain things in his life, and really taking steps of maturing and just growing up and not being as obnoxious, not being as sexist, not being as much of a jerk to people. He's still rough around the edges, but more and more in this series, you can see that he really does care about good. And yes, he's been looking for his value in all the wrong places by trying to just one-up other Green Lanterns and every other hero and talk himself up. You know, he's got all kinds of crazy insecurity that comes out in this form of brash arrogance. But some of that starts to get worked through, and you realize that at the core, he really does want to do good. He's got his heart in a number of ways in the right places. And it was the Guy Gardner Warrior series that I really started to see and appreciate that, and then suddenly care about this character like I never had before, because he was more relatable, more appealing as a character, and his power set for me, I thought was really, really cool. So Guy Gardner Warrior, starting with issue number 18. If you want to go on this part of his journey, start at 18 and just see how far you make it before you lose interest. I made it up into about, at least I want to say the 30s before I was like, okay, I'm not as interested in where things are going now, but I'm still really glad that I got a good taste of this part of Guy Gardner's history. Well, fast forward to the fall of 2004, and we get Green Lantern Rebirth #1, which was endeavoring to bring back the Green Lantern Corps into DC Comics and deal with a bunch of crazy mess that had happened in evolution of these characters. Hal Jordan at this time had become the Spectre of all things. Of course, Guy Gardner was Warrior with these crazy Vuldarian gore monster powers. And this miniseries that went 6 issues long endeavored to reset, bring these characters back, steer them back so that by the end we can have Hal Jordan and Guy Gardner, among others, as Green Lanterns again, in a Green Lantern Corps. And so, although it happens pretty quick, I don't think it was altogether unsatisfying. There was a story reason for it happening, but Guy Gardner basically gets a genetic cleansing that just needed to happen to take him back to being a normal human. And then in the course of this miniseries, he also becomes a Green Lantern again. So, if you want to see that whole journey where he becomes Warrior, you're going to want to read Green Lantern Rebirth #1 through 6 so that you can see how he became a Green Lantern again. After that, if you're still interested in Guy Gardner, curious about where he's going to go, how he's written as a character, there's a couple different things I would recommend. One is the miniseries Green Lantern Corps Recharge, which was also a 6-issue miniseries about getting this new corps up and running again. And so, featured heavily is both Kyle Rayner, who had been the Green Lantern up to this point, the only Green Lantern, and so I think they wanted to assure fans that, hey, Kyle's not going anywhere, Kyle fans. He's still very prominent, even though Hal is now the Green Lantern in the Green Lantern book. Green Lantern Corps stories are going to heavily feature Kyle, and so Kyle is in there, but then the very next Green Lantern, maybe even the one that's featured a little bit more in some ways, is Guy Gardner. They knew there were Guy Gardner fans there who'd be excited to see him as a Green Lantern again, and so this miniseries heavily features both of these characters. And then the follow-up to that is, of that time period, the Green Lantern Corps series, with issue number 1 starting in 2006. And this definitely features Guy a lot more. You see him more on the covers. The stories focus on him some more. You see more of his character. You see what ways he has grown up and matured, what ways he still hasn't. There's some covers that clearly show us that, yeah, okay, he's still kind of sexist, but again, he's much more of a palatable character at this point, much more of a relatable character. And he goes through some tough stuff, and so he's one that I can still appreciate and still root for in some ways. And so the Green Lantern Corps series that started in 2006 by, let's see, Tomasi? No, this is the Gibbons, written by Gibbons. But this was definitely a series that was the first time, because I hadn't gone back at this time and started reading Warrior yet. I didn't catch up on that history of Guy Gardner's until just a couple of years ago. This was the time where I started really reading stories featuring Guy Gardner and saying, oh, he's not as much of an obnoxious kid, a brat, as I remember him being when I would see little bits of him in Justice League International back in the 90s. He became just more of a character that I could follow and root for to some degree in this book. So Green Lantern Corps, that starts in 2006, is a solid series. And then sort of the New 52 reboot of that series that started in 2011, written by Tomasi. This one also heavily features Guy Gardner, but also equally features John Stewart. And so by this time, I think fans of the animated series, the Justice League animated series, where John Stewart was heavily featured, they wanted to appeal to them as well. And Kyle fans, maybe not so much anymore. And so Kyle doesn't figure near as prominently. I'm not even sure if he's in this series at all. But Guy and John Stewart are the main focus. And again, you can see more of his rough and tough personality, some of that immaturity, but still a lot of likability for this character at this point. And so if you want to keep going on your Guy journey, then you probably want to read Green Lantern Corps number 1 and beyond, that started in September of 2011. Now, in this run, they do eventually publish an issue 0 that retells Guy Gardner's origin story, because the New 52 was a soft, too hard reboot of the DC Universe and its continuity. In this story, we still have a Guy Gardner who was disrespected by his father, still had a brother that was always appreciated more by his father, and Guy Gardner just doesn't seem to be able to measure up in his father's eyes. So that element is still strongly there. What seems to be removed, as far as I can tell in this issue 0, is any abuse physically or verbally when Guy Gardner was younger. And so we're missing that element. And he's kind of retconned so that in the New 52, he was never really as obnoxious and sexist as he was written to be in the 90s. I can understand why they would do that. At the same time, it's kind of like the Han shot first controversy. If you don't have Han shooting first, then you don't get to see his evolution, his growth, his maturing as a character. And similarly with Guy Gardner, even though I probably skip a lot of those back issues when I go back to the Justice League International stuff, because I don't know how much of him and the other antics and comedy stuff I'll be able to stand. Even though, that's not for me, knowing that that's where he was and then seeing and being able to trace his journey of maturity is something that I appreciate. So I've got mixed feelings about it. But this, Green Lantern Corps number 0, that's a solid way to get Guy Gardner's origin. I don't think if you are watching the movie and you want to know more about that Green Lantern, that version of Guy Gardner, I don't think 0 is sufficient, because in the movie, he's not based on the New 52 and beyond version of Guy Gardner, who's grown up a significant amount. He's based on pretty much the worst lowest point for Guy Gardner's character. So yeah, mixed feelings. I think 0 is still a good way to get an origin story for Guy Gardner, but probably not the best one. One thing that I appreciate, though, about both of these origin stories for Guy Gardner is that they still retain what I think is the heart, the core flaw in Guy Gardner that is worth us paying attention to as geeks. And as Christian geeks, there's some things we can really meditate on and benefit from meditating on as we think about Guy Gardner and some relevant scripture to his story. There's 4 passages that come to mind for me. The first is Ephesians 2:1, or 2:1 through 10, excuse me. When I think about how much Guy Gardner wants to be respected by his dad, and then beyond that, just sees everything as a competition, wanting to one-up other Green Lanterns, other heroes. He's trying to build his sense of identity in what he accomplishes, how good he is at stuff, the recognition that he gets from others. And that is mankind's broken default mindset. But it's not the mindset we're meant to be in. It's not where we're meant to find our sense of identity. Ephesians 2:1 through 10 gives us an idea of where our identity really comes from. It says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived, in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind." That's the sorry state that we are all in by default. Verse 4, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace," meaning undeserved favor, "you have been saved, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus." Believers in Jesus will be these eternal monuments. That's massive significance. Monuments to the amazing love and patience and grace of God for us. Verse 8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So doing good, accomplishing good, that is a key part of our purpose, but it's not where we get our identity from. Our identity comes from the massive worth that God gives us in that he died for us when we were totally unworthy of that, so that we could be forgiven and spend eternity with him and be these amazing monuments to who he is for all of eternity. That's amazing. And I so wish that Guy Gardner, or people like him, and myself, because I forget this so much, would know this, would remember this, would live in light of this. It's massive in its implications for how we view ourselves and our lives. Ephesians 4:15. This comes to mind because it was pointed out to me, and I found this fascinating, and it really is what led me to give Guy Gardner another try a few years back. But a fan of Guy Gardner pointed out that Guy's brash, rude behavior and just how he talks and just says whatever's on his mind is part of it. It's an outworking of him being honest. And it used to be, unfortunately, it was de-emphasized. I don't know if it's going to be eventually coming back. I think it might have been mentioned in Green Lantern recently. But it used to be that the requirement to be a Green Lantern is that you be honest and fearless. Honest and fearless. And at some point in Jeff Johns' reboot, it was at the beginning of Jeff Johns' reboot with Green Lantern Rebirth, it was just about being fearless. It wasn't about being honest anymore. That just seemed to be forgotten. But that is such a valuable trait, a heroic trait, one that should be put in front of us as readers. It's a valuable thing to remember, the importance of being honest. Well, anyway, Guy Gardner's honesty combined with his lack of character, his lack of maturity, led to him hurting other people. But that's not the way that we are meant to live. Ephesians 4:15 and 16. Rather, speaking the truth in love, well, just actually 15 is, I think, enough. Speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. So we are meant to speak the truth in love at the same time. These are not two ends of a spectrum. They are things we are meant to incorporate into our communications, our attitudes, our relationships at the same time, to the same degree. Speaking the truth in love or out of love or motivated by love. And in doing that, we are to grow up, which Guy Gardner really needed to do. Grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. And then next, I think of 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1. You could read the whole passage. It's great. But because it talks about love and the nature of love. But just the first verse says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. That's who Guy Gardner was in Justice League International. That's who he largely was in the Superman movie. He was lacking love. And so every time he opens his mouth to the other people that are around him, he's a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. He might be being honest and authentic and transparent. These are good things. And saying what's on his mind, not always a good thing. But he had not love. And so is anyone going to pay attention to him? Are they far less likely, actually, to pay attention to him? I think that's the case, that he might have some good things to say now and then, but if he's a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal while he's doing it or in every other time, people are going to be less and less likely to listen to him. And I think as believers, we can learn from that as a cautionary tale that yes, we want to speak the truth, but we also want that truth to not merely be heard, but also considered, to be persuasive. And that requires love, and it requires growing up into the maturity that Christ wants for us so that we can have the tact and wisdom to know how to express ourselves in a way that does not compromise truth, but that is also persuasive, likely to be received well. Anyway, that's 1 Corinthians 13:1. And then finally, 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. Guy Gardner comes from a past of great pain, especially in his pre-New 52 origin. And I think that pain, we are supposed to understand, fuels a lot of his dysfunction, fuels a lot of his drive to be heroic and do the right thing. Also, fuels his unhealthy drive, his sinful drive to one-up other people and be the best and be seen as the best and all that kind of stuff. That's what he's doing with that pain from his past. But it's not what we're meant to do with the pain, the suffering, the affliction that we experience. We get an idea of what we're supposed to do with that in 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. It says, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Now, he doesn't get specific about what that comfort looks like. I think that's because it can take a broad spectrum of forms. We can find comfort in some specific truth relevant to our situation in God's Word that helps us to be encouraged, to have hope for the future, to endure in the present. We can also find comfort through other people who act as the hands and feet of Christ as we're meant to in the local church. I think the local church is so valuable when we learn to be compassionate and transparent and truthful and authentic with each other. Then we can really receive comfort and then in turn have the opportunity to comfort others. And that's what, I would want someone like Guy Gardner to do, what I hope that I will do as I reflect on past pains of mine or other pains that I experience in the future. So anyway, there's just a lot. Guy Gardner has become just a much more rich character to me in the last few years. And so it was actually a treat. It wouldn't have been to me 10 years ago, but it was actually a treat to see him in that Superman movie, even with all of his roughness, even with all the things about him that were unlikable. I appreciate his inclusion there. And what I was led to reflect on after the movie, going back and thinking about his history in the comics. I hope you found something in that enjoyable as well. My ring selection for this week is the Star Sapphire ring, representing love. I've been reflecting on that, of course, thinking about Guy Gardner, and just like, I think he functions well as a cautionary tale, so I don't necessarily want him to be all cleaned up, but he reminds me, Pater, you've got to figure out how to speak the truth in love more and more effectively online in your interactions with other people. And so I'm thinking about love at the moment and the role that it ought to play more of in my life. But those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, I hope you will feel free to leave your comments below. I love getting those and interacting with you there. You can also find a ton more content. You can get this content as a monthly podcast if you want, and a ton more stuff made for you at christiangeekcentral.com, where we're endeavoring to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.